Hello, I am Brady, and I am here to present to you about the skill that is critical thinking. This will be done in a two-part video format, and in this first video, I'll be going over the ideas of critical thinking, what it is, how it's used, and the benefits of its use. To kick us off, what is critical thinking? If you have heard of critical thinking before, most likely when you were in school, it is a set of skills that can help one obtain better, more truthful information. Or for a more definitive answer, we can look to the Foundation for Critical Thinking and its Defining Critical Thinking section, in which they define it as: critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In its exemplary form, it is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions: clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. Which is a mouthful, to say the least. For my best attempt to boil this down into a more digestible concept, I would say critical thinking is a discipline or a skill set that uses information gathering as a way to direct behavior in a responsible manner, all the while adhering to universal intellectual values. Now, I think this is an alright definition, but perhaps a more direct definition comes from one David Barnhill, a former director at the University of Wisconsin, when he wrote, "What is the alternative to being biased and one-sided? Critical thinking." There are a few misconceptions about critical thinking I personally had that I would like to dispel before properly defining the use of critical thinking. First and foremost, critical thinking is undoubtedly a skill set, meaning that it is not simply a checklist that you might find in a classroom setting. And although these checklists hold relevant things to look for when determining an information source's integrity, critical thinking breaks away from the confines of a checklist by having a better, more instinctual understanding of what to look for when determining whether a piece of information is credible or not. For example, many news sources will use colorful, emotion-provoking language, and as such, a common checklist will tell you to look for this. And rightfully so. Noticing this language before it affects you can change the entire framing of a story. This concept is better presented from my personal communications with Patrick Barclay, an associate professor at the University of Guelph, that when asked, "Do you have any ideas on bias in the media and how to combat it?" wrote, "To combat it, choose media that uses neutral language. The more emotional language they use, the more biased they probably are. Anyone who is intentionally triggering certain emotions, for example, anger, outrage, fear, is probably extremely biased. Also, choose media that sticks to the facts, what happened, rather than discussion or opinions about those facts. Ultimately, media exists to sell stories. It's driven by what media thinks its consumers want, and emotional language sells." With this being said, a checklist will surely ask you to do these things, but to break away from the checklist and to engrave it into yourself is not only superior to relying on a checklist, it is critical thinking. One other short misconception I had with critical thinking is that it was difficult to do. This misconception came again from the fact that critical thinking is a skill set. With it being a skill set, it would obviously be hard to do at first. But once you settle into the ideas of critical thinking, the act of determining the truth of the matter becomes second nature. So if by the end of this video you find yourself wanting to take critical thinking skills into your own hands, remember, the reward at the end of the tunnel is well worth the effort to get there. How it's used. When it comes to acting upon critical thinking, there's a general thought process that is followed. First, you'll be hearing or reading something new, and perhaps shocking. And given this news, in an act of critical thinking, you would decide to investigate, acting upon the earlier mentioned intellectual values of accuracy by determining the truth behind the shocking news. And as to determine the accuracy of this news, you would dive into some personal research. researching different news sources of differing opinions to maintain fairness and precision in your gathered information, all the while determining sound evidence and good reasons from your sources. With your gathered evidence, you would then make an educated decision, deciding upon whether or not to believe the earlier shocking news or only parts of the news. Now, with the general process of critical thinking in mind, it is important to note that critical thinking is not something you have to use for every piece of information you gather. If you are one day told that 8 plus 3 equals 10, it would not make sense to dive into personal research, spending your valuable time on a subject that is ultimately inconsequential. Another way to think about this is if you never intend to spread nor care about a piece of questionable information, you can decide to never find out the truth behind the matter. That being said, it doesn't mean you should believe the information unconditionally, but rather keep it in your mind as something undetermined. Again, mentioning back to the foundation for critical thinking, you must determine the relevance behind something before trying to act upon it. I should mention that when using relevance in this context, I mean personal relevance. If you, for some reason, really want to find out for yourself if 8 plus 3 truly equals 10, then no one will stop you. And as a result, you'll be able to solve your dilemma of whether 8 plus 3 equals 10. Thus, one of the main purposes of critical thinking is that you should be able to learn true information about what you find relevant. Benefits of its use. Aside from the obvious benefit of using critical thinking, that being finding out more factual information, there are a few other small side benefits I should mention. One of which being that with continued use of critical thinking, it will grow easier to determine what sounds false and what has signs of bias. And as another side benefit, having more truthful information at your disposal can help in any number of endeavors. For example, when buying a car, getting a loan, investing, even what restaurant is best to eat at. Critical thinking is not restricted to any one type of information. Now, with an understanding of the many facets of critical thinking, I would like to thank you for listening to my video up until this point, and to tell you that if you have an interest in what I have to say, I ask that you check out the second part of this video series, linked in the description. In that video, I dive deeper into the historical and current day cases where critical thinking would save you from misinformation, as well as detailing misinformation in its many potential dangerous pitfalls. This has been Brady speaking, and I will hopefully see you in the next video.